Give me a second. Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. I'm really excited to talk to today's guest. I even got a new shirt because when I was a little girl, this was before Audible, I actually used to read books with my eyes instead of listening to them with my ears. And my favorite book growing up was All Creatures Great and Small by James Herriot. That was in my teen years. And then in my 20s, it was a book called You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay. In my 30s, it was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And in my 40s, it was The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. These are 4 books that I read over and over. And I used to say, God, wouldn't it be great to meet the author and ask them questions? Well, there's a book today that's like that I've read at least 3 times. And it is so cool to be living in a day and age that you actually get to meet the author of a book that you like and get to talk to him about it. So I am so excited and honored to introduce today Professor Richard Wrangham. He wrote a book called Catching Fire: How Cooking Made Us Human. It's a must read for many reasons. Please welcome him to the show. Thank you so much for doing this. I am so honored.
Thank you, AJ. It's really fun to be here.
Yeah. And it's so great because what happens with this show is I've got like a 6-month waiting list, and it was really lucky that we had a cancellation today because you were introduced to me by a previous guest who also wrote a fabulous book called Burn, Dr. Herman Ponsner. So, because it was just in the back of my mind, like, gosh, wouldn't it be so cool to talk to you someday? Never thinking that I would, because your book has made a big impact on a lot of people because it was recommended by people that I really admire in this world, doctors in Santa Rosa, California. You spoke at the McDougall Advanced Study Weekend. I saw that lecture. It was fabulous, by the way.
Great.
Yeah.
And that was what, 10 years ago, something like that?
I believe so. But even before that, because I believe your book came out in 2009, and it was 2011. I was a patient at the True North Health Center in Santa Rosa, and your book was recommended by the co-founder, Dr. Jennifer Morano, and she wants to send her regards. I said, do you have any questions? She goes, she's on a polar bear expedition right now. And she said, you completely changed about how she thought about cooked food. So it was a wonderful book. And you must have had a really wonderful life, starting with, you got to work with Jane Goodall. What was that like?
Well, that was incredibly exciting because there I was at the age of 21 or something. And I just finished college studying zoology, didn't know exactly what I was going to do, and got the opportunity to be a research assistant to Jane Goodall. So I was plunged all of a sudden into a little national park on the west side of Tanzania and spent what came to be 3 years just living with chimpanzees in the wild, myself and a small group of researchers. And it was an incredibly exciting time because it was a time when, for the really first time in, ever, and people were able to just trail along behind individual chimpanzees and watch what they were doing all day. So I did this from dawn till dusk. I think literally I was the first person to do a PhD following an animal from dawn to dusk and basing that as my data. And what I was studying was feeding behavior. And so I got to kind of feel like a chimp, because I would wake up at the same time as a chimp and then be with them all day. And I got a sense of, one individual, how are they planning their day? What is their meal regime doing to them? How is it affecting their ability to interact with other people? How is it affecting their state of well-being? What's the sort of relationship between just resting and traveling and cramming in these meals? It was just an enthralling experience. The community had something like 50 individuals in it, and I worked with about 12 adult males. Females are too complicated, because their food choices are affected by things like their pregnancy and their lactation and so on. And males just sort of trudge along being males all the time. So to kind of make things simpler, I worked with males, and I got to know the food choices and the feeding behavior of those males, really, really well.
How long did you spend every day doing this? And were you looking through a telescope? Did they know they were being observed?
Oh no, I really was, trailing along behind them. So the day would start in a sense the previous day. So if I was going to do observations on a Monday, then on the Sunday evening, I would make sure that I knew where some chimpanzees were sleeping. And then by 6 a.m., or even before then, I would arrive back at where they're sleeping, choose my target individual, wait for him to come down from his nest. He would be sleeping up several yards high, and then often you'd be walking just 5 or 6 yards behind that individual, and you stay with them all day. When they go up into a tree, you don't climb up with them. You just stay on the ground and watch from the ground, and then you do it all day, 12 hours until they go to bed.
Wow. Have you ever heard of the Hawthorne effect?
No.
That's the thing in science. Hold on. I want to read this to you because I just pulled it up. Occurs when people behave differently because they know they are being watched. It affects all sorts of behavior, such as dietary habits or hygiene practices, because these have considerable opportunity for instantaneous modifications. So I'm wondering, did they act differently because they knew you were watching them?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting theoretical point, because if you're not watching them, you don't know how they're behaving. But you don't get any sense that their behavior is affected normally. So they do not glance at you. They don't even walk around you. If you're on the path and they happen to be change direction and walk straight towards you, they might walk past you and brush by you so that their hairs, touch your leg. It is certainly in the early stages of watching a group of chimps in the wild, you have to recognize that their behavior is changed because they run away from you. But patiently, this is what Jane Goodall did. She got to know the chimps to the point where they treat the human much as they treat a species of other primate, like a baboon. Baboons will walk around among the chimps, and the chimps pay them no attention. And it's the same with humans in the end. And that's just such a privilege, because it means that you are just up close and personal. It's wonderful.
That must have been one of the most extraordinary years of your life.
Yes, because that was a time when I was not so much doing science as just absorbing the excitement of understanding what it's like to be another species, trying to get into the skin. Subsequently, I went off and started my own study of chimpanzees in a neighboring country, Uganda, and I've been working with them for 30-something years. So, this extraordinary experience of working with Jane was tremendously inspiring, and gave me the opportunity to indulge my interests in nature, in animal behavior, in chimpanzees in particular, and their significance of human evolution for the rest of my life. It's wonderful.
It's interesting that you said that you studied the males because females are more complicated. I can vouch for that. We are. Was there anything that surprised you?
Well, it's hard to recall exactly the state of naivete that I had when I went into the wild. I had previously studied antelopes, and in a similar way by watching them from many hours at a time, but in that case from a vehicle. And within about 20 minutes of seeing my first chimpanzee in the wild, or maybe a few hours, it became clear that they're not like an antelope. You clearly know that they are a thinking individual. You see them. I mean, exactly how we know that we see them thinking is an interesting question, but you get a very swift impression that they are designing little strategies with each other that depend on a capacity of thought that is just not present in most animals. And it feels like you're dealing with a species that has got some human characteristics. And of course, in many ways, very obvious ways, they are. As Jane was the first to really point out in a major way. I mean, they use a lot of facial expressions and gestural expressions that are rather similar to ours. And then when you go at a deeper level, it turns out that their social relationships are rather similar to ours. even to the point of the social structure, with the males having really important political bonds that they use at the expense of females, and so on. The thing that was most surprising and dramatic was that during the time I was there, we were first learning about the ways in which a resident group of chimps relates to those that are living in a neighboring territory. So our chimps, as it were, they occupied about 3 parallel valleys, and then occasionally they would go into one of the neighboring valleys to those 3, and there they might see other chimps, strangers, and they would shout at them routinely and then come back again. But we also discovered during that phase that they would also go hunting the other chimps. And so this was a huge shock, that they would go and try and deliberately attack and even kill members of neighboring groups. So that was, one very big surprise, because animals weren't supposed to do that. Only humans were supposed to do that. And now it turns out that the most closely related species of ape to humans, one of the 2 most closely related, goes out and does something incredibly human-like. That really brings home the likelihood that biology is affecting their behavior and ours.
Wow. Well, now we know where we get that behavior from, huh?
Well, exactly, that's right. But here's the other thing that was really fun. It was during this period that because I was getting up at dawn, or before dawn, to go and be with the chimps by the time they were at dawn, I saw something that nobody had seen before. And that was that within about an hour of their leaving their sleeping nests and getting up in the morning, every now and again, maybe once or twice a month for a particular individual, they would go off and do something very, very odd. Initially, it looked like feeding behavior. They were going to a small patch of a particular species of plant, a herb, and taking some leaves and putting them into their mouths. And then they were swallowing. Well, that sounds like feeding, but it wasn't. And the way we know it wasn't is, first of all, when you look at them very, very carefully, you see that they're not chewing the leaf. They're leaving their jaws very slack, even though the mouth is closed. And they make these sort of rather odd movements with the tongue and the mouth. And it looks as though what they're doing is just swallowing the leaves whole. And then you can go through the grisly act of collecting their dung and washing it. And lo and behold, you find whole leaves that have no indication that they've been through an animal's gut. And yet they've spent 24 hours in the gut of a chimpanzee. And this was the first evidence of self-medication behavior in chimpanzees. And since then, a lot of evidence of self-medication has come out in the great apes, but also a whole variety of other animals of all kinds. But this is one of the first cases of any animal. And it was so striking, because they know exactly what they're doing. They make a very deliberate journey to one of these patches of food. They know where it is. And then they select these leaves incredibly carefully. They pull them one at a time. And so within 1 minute, only like about 5 leaves will they swallow very, very slowly, as opposed to normally 10 times that rate, shoving a whole lot of leaves into your mouth and chewing hard on them. So it's a very different behavior from feeding. And it's so lovely to think that self-medication of that type has gone back since the common ancestry that we share with chimpanzees. And that's 6-7 million years.
That is so interesting. Maybe that's like the equivalent of them having a cup of coffee in the morning.
Well, we wondered exactly what it was. Could it be something psychoactive, or would it be something medicative? And initially, it was hard to tell, but we now have pretty good evidence that what they're doing is essentially scouring their gut. They are helping get rid of some of the species of intestinal worms. And here's what happens. The leaf, always, they select in different communities, different places. It turns out that chimpanzees do this all over Africa. And wherever they are, they always select a species of leaf that has got strong, stiff hairs on one side. And then when they fold it, the hairs on the two halves that they fold come together and create a sort of cave, because the hairs keep the leaf from becoming entirely flat against the other side. And so the result is it's like a little cave. And when they swallow the leaves, then some of the intestinal worms swim into the little cave created by the hairs on the leaf and then get carried out in the dung. So it's a way of removing the worms from your gut.
Wow. Well, good to know if I ever get worms.
We can help you in the bush. Yeah.
Are you still in touch with Jane at all?
Oh, yes, absolutely. She's she's been in Bournemouth, her childhood home, for all the past year, and I think we're in touch every month probably, on one thing or another. And actually, just this coming weekend, there's a new radio play about her, which is going to be produced, which is going to be heard in Britain and heard on BBC World programming, about In the Shadow of Man. So she's still very active. She's still, doing great work with the chimps, but she's become a kind of ambassador for humanity as well as for chimpanzees. She's just got a new book. I think it's, what is it called? Her previous book was called Reason for Hope, and this is called something like The Coming of Hope. It's not that, but it's something like that. And she's trying to emphasize to young people just how important it is that we keep a positive attitude to life, and that'll help both with individuals' personal development and also with the environment.
People are asking if you could repeat the name of that leaf that they were chewing.
Oh, the leaf is called Aspilia, Aspilia. And so that's one that they swallow in Gombe. It's swallowed in a few other places as well. But in the place where I now work, in Kibale, there are two different species of leaf that they swallow. So the important thing is not the name of the leaf so much as the fact that it's hairy, and that when you fold it on the hairy side, then it creates this little sort of cave for the worms to swim into.
Yeah, and they all do it. They didn't have to learn. They just...
Isn't that amazing? That's right. That every chimpanzee community shares this interest in finding a way to get rid of their worms.
People are saying they wish you had narrated the audible version of the book because you have a great voice.
Oh, that is so nice. But of course, in Britain, we always think American voices are great, and in America, people love British voices. So it all depends where you come from.
I'm curious. Your book was published in 2009, and that's the same year that Catching Fire for the Hunger Games was published. Did people ever mix up the books?
Oh, they did. That's clever a spot of you. Yes. Those books by Suzanne Collins. There was the Hunger Games, there was Mockingjay and Catching Fire. And you could buy all three of them. And I have somewhere a screenshot of the fact that there was a point at which you could buy the Hunger Games and Mockingjay and my version of Catching Fire, all three of them cheap. So they were offering them a special lot. So even Amazon got muddled about those books.
That is so funny. If you were writing the book today, would you change anything or add anything?
Well, I would add a few things because in that book, the argument I make is that based on what we understand of the fossils of humans, we can infer that cooking and the control of fire began something like 2 million years ago. I say literally 1.9 million years ago. And the earliest evidence for the control of fire was not nearly as early as that. So in 2009, the earliest evidence for the control of fire, it depends on which evidence you accept, but let's say it was about 500,000 years. But since then, there have been quite a few archaeological discoveries that push the date for the control of fire further back in the direction that I believe eventually it will be shown to be, which is 1.9. So there was um, a, a discovery in South Africa at a cave called Wonderwerk, where humans were associated with fire at 1 million years ago. There's a place in Israel where early humans were associated at 900,000 years ago. And then just recently, there's a place in Kenya where people have made a very strong argument for control of fire at 1.6 million years ago. So it's getting closer. So I would like to have added some of that archaeological evidence.
That is so interesting because it was 10 years between reading your book with my eyes and then listening to it on Audible. But I remembered so much about your book because it really one of the things that was so interesting to me. So I'm a person that is on a vegan diet for almost 45 years for ethical and health reasons and environmental as well. But I have a lot of guests on the show that are vegan and some of them follow a 100% raw food diet. And I find them actually fascinating because I don't know how they do it because I tried the raw food diet for a couple of years. And by the way, I think the raw food diet is fabulous if you can do it. I had what was called pre-cancer and I healed it using a raw food diet. But I found that it was very difficult for me because I was always cold for one. And it was, I had to then go, instead of eating the kind of foods that I really enjoy, like potatoes and rice, the starches, I had to eat a lot of fat, which I don't like so much. And it kind of made me fat. But I respect their diet and I'm fascinated by them. But what was really interesting to me in your book, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I remembered is that even though humans are literally the only species that cooks their food, that knows how to cook their food, that when offered, even species that don't eat cooked food seem to prefer it.
Absolutely. Yes. No, I mean, cooked food has got all these biological advantages that animals in general are pre-adapted to appreciate. And I think the reason that they like cooked food is that basically what cooked food does is, in a kind of way, pre-digest the food. It makes the food more digestible. And animals are very sensitive to finding food that is as digestible as possible. So the kinds of ways in which the natural circumstance means that a food is got its proteins already partly broken down, maybe by rotting or for some other reason, means that very often they're more attractive to those animals because they are pre-digested. Something like the presence of glutamate, which is detected by the umami taste, is an indication that proteins have been more digested than if you don't taste the glutamate. So animals in general, and in fact, I think all animals that have so far been tested prefer their food cooked to raw. I bet there will be some eventually that don't for some reason or another, because biology is always diverse. But all of the great apes, any monkey that's been tested, all the lab animals that have been tested, our pets like cats and dogs, all of them prefer their food cooked if they can get it.
And even reptiles?
Yes. What was the reptile that I came across?
Wasn't it a snake?
Pythons. I actually can't say that pythons prefer it, but they definitely get more energy out of their food when it's cooked, because Stephen Secor joined us and did some experiments on that and very careful physiological measurements. But I think it may be him that worked with bearded lizards and found that they prefer their food cooked. I think that's right.
What about insects? Have you tested it on insects?
No, I haven't tested them, and I don't know of anyone who has tested them. But I have just thrown out occasionally little bits of cooked food and raw food, and seen wasps taking cooked meat in preference to raw meat.
That's
So
very.
my guess is that they again will prefer it.
Do you think part of the reason that all the species that would normally eat their food raw prefer to cook has to do with caloric density, that people struggle to get enough calories throughout most of human history, and that they just recognize that it's more valuable because it's going to take less effort to get more calories?
I think you're spot on. Absolutely. The way that we approach food is so different from the way that animals tend to approach it. When I say we, I mean people in contemporary the West, but in general in the world, um, because animals are. I think the way to think about them is they're hungry all the time. When I went to uh, Gombe, Jane Goodall's site, and first started there, what we uh, what we as researchers were doing was following what Jane had set up, which was that the way to attract chimps to a place where we could see them was by putting out bananas. And during my time there, the banana system was pretty much reduced to nothing, so that we could make sure we could follow them in the wild without worrying about affecting their behavior. But it was so interesting with the bananas because there you've got the chimps surrounded by their forest, and they're going to be eating for many hours a day, and yet they would spend sometimes several hours sitting around in a small area that Jane had organized, waiting for a banana. Now, humans are not normally going to do that. If I tell you, hey, AJ, I'm going to leave 3 bananas in the backyard for you, but you've got to stay there and wait for them. I don't think you're going to do that because you're not hungry enough. But chimps are hungry enough that that is what is really important for them. And basically, the more I understood about chimps, the more I saw that a tremendous amount of the way that they structure their time can be seen in terms of getting just a little bit of extra calories. And as we have now come to study the biology of chimps, we know that just a little bit of extra calories means a huge difference to how long a female takes between babies. If she can have just slightly higher quality of fruit during the time that she is lactating one baby, then the time it'll take before she has her next baby will be reduced by a few months. So calories are just hugely important. And we know that cooking increases the number of calories you get out of food. And so it's not surprising that all animals like their food cooked.
Well, that's why when people are trying to lose weight, eating more raw food can be so beneficial.
Absolutely. No, eating raw food is a terrific thing to do, provided you understand what you're doing. And what you're doing basically is starving yourself. I mean, depending on exactly how you organize your raw food diet, and you're starving yourself, mostly with a very good um, distribution of minerals and vitamins. So much better than simply eating very little food. At least you're getting food, you're working your body well, but it is putting yourself into a position that humans have not been adapted to doing for now, I think 1.9 million years. Some people would say only 500,000 years. I bet they're wrong. But anyway, it's for hundreds of thousands of years, a very long time.
Well, one of the things that struck me in the book, and again, listen, I am not in, I'm for whatever works for a person. I always tell people do the least restrictive diet you can do that will give you the results that you're seeking. So the people that are doing raw food successfully, God bless them, keep doing them. But one of the things that you said that I thought was interesting in your book was that there have been no successful raw fooders in the wild, that the people that are doing raw food, that it's in an urban setting. And it's a little bit different because you mentioned how when a primate gets an apple in the wild, it's about as sweet as a carrot. And fruit today, bananas, they're incredibly sweet and they're actually more calorically dense than the kind of food we would find in a setting like that.
Yes, I mean, what is so striking is that the raw foodists the studies of raw foodists that we have show that it is pretty difficult to get enough calories to maintain your body weight. Obviously, raw foodists do succeed in doing that, but it's difficult. And the striking thing about that is that the conditions under which those raw foodists have been studied are absolutely ideal for eating raw food. And just to enumerate some of those points, as you said, they're eating agriculturally produced food that has been selected to have very low fiber compared to a typical wild fruit, and very high number of sugars. If you're talking about the fruits or the vegetables, it's true for all of those things. Secondly, the raw foodists are eating food that comes from all over the world. So that means that somebody who is living in northern climes is not going to suffer through the winter because they can get food from the tropics or the southern hemisphere during the northern winter. So imagine if you were a raw foodist living only on the food that was produced locally. It would be absolutely hopeless during the poor seasons, the winters. And then, raw foodists are using electrical blenders and other machines to help pre-digest the food as much as possible without the use of heat. Well, if you're in the wild, you might be able to pound a seed with a rock or something, but it's not the equivalent of using an electric blender to do it. And so there's another huge advantage to the raw foodists. And yet, with all these advantages, they still are finding it very, very difficult to maintain body weight. And as you probably remember from the book, there are these remarkable studies showing that if you look at the women, if women on a 100% raw diet, even when they're eating meat as part of it, which some people do, of course, 50% of them have completely stopped menstruating, and another 20% or so are certainly not ovulating, so that the average woman on a raw food diet under the ideal conditions is unable to have a baby. So that speaks, I think, very clearly to the notion that if we were going to try and persuade some hunter-gatherer group in the tropical areas to undertake a raw food diet, well, they would simply die out. Humans are just not adapted in the same way that other animals are to eating their food raw.
Right. Well, the argument I hear sometimes is, well, that's how it was at the very beginning, that there was, because I don't know when the world started or human history started, but the very beginning, people, even humans, probably were eating a raw diet, right? At the very, very beginning of time, whenever that was.
Well, our ancestors would certainly have been eating a raw food diet at some point. And then the question is, how long ago are we talking about? And the reason that I have said that I think that it's pretty clear that we could not have eaten raw food or relied on raw food for basically 2 million years, the last 2 million years, is because we have a very good idea of what our ancestors looked like from the point of view of their biologically relevant anatomy. They looked like us. They had a rib cage that did not flare outwards in the way that it does in a gorilla or a chimpanzee to account for a capacious gut inside the body. Instead, our rib cages are relatively flat and go down with a relatively flat abdomen because we got a relatively small intestine. So what I'm talking about is the combination of the small intestine and the large intestine. And in particular, our large intestine, our colon, is about 2/3 of the size that it would be if we were a gorilla or a chimpanzee for our body mass. And it's because our colon is relatively small that we cannot retain fibrous foods long enough in our gut to be able to get the calories out of them that a great ape can. So we can reconstruct our ancestors for the whole of the last 2 million years as being unable to process that fiber in the way that a great ape can. Prior to that, then that's fine. They were able to eat raw food, but subsequently, I don't think they could.
So Sherry, first of all, I want to thank Violet Rodriguez for the super chat donation, but Sherry, who's watching live, who is a raw foodist, says, when I asked you about, do you think the reason that all the species prefer cooked food is because of caloric density? She says, does preference mean it's healthy? Wouldn't they also prefer chocolate cake if offered? Because if we took like very unhealthy food like McDonald's and offered it to the primates, wouldn't they prefer that over their diet? Because as well?
Yeah, it's a great point, and you're absolutely right. They would, and of course, it's all a question of what do you mean by healthy? Because from the point of view of an animal that is basically starving, probably the most healthy thing that they can do is to get more calories. Just give sugar to someone who's hasn't been able to eat anything for weeks. So yes, animals would indeed prefer to have a hamburger with all its sins, and but I would argue that it actually is healthy for them. No, it's not healthy for us. Why not? Because we got enough calories.
We've got too many calories, I got to tell you.
Too many calories. That's why raw food is actually healthy for us.
Yeah.
But raw food is not healthy if you are struggling down the Amazon and haven't eaten much for 3 weeks.
Yeah, this is this is such an interesting topic to me. I love talking about it because, that's the one thing that's so interesting to me is that in addition to not cooking their food, all the other species except for humans, and with the possible exception of domesticated pets, they don't eat processed food.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they don't have the chance.
Right. And to me that, when you think about it, because I'm very interested in what people eat in helping to solve this obesity epidemic. The only species that aren't at a normal weight are the ones that eat processed food. It's not even that they eat meat that isn't the problem. It's processed food, because all the other species don't have to worry about how much to eat. And you never see a gazelle on the African savannah thinking, well, should I have another blade of grass? Only humans weigh and measure their food or count calories, carbs, or points. It's because they're not eating the right food.
Yeah, I mean, humans are the species to which we give the food. And so, dogs and cats, they become fat. And it's not because we give them too much meat. It's not even because we give them too much food. It's because we give them too much processed food.
That's right. Amen to that. And that's why I love having people on of differing opinions, because one thing that I've never interviewed anyone that thinks processed food is good in any walk of life.
Well, but again, processed food is terrific for you if you're starving.
If you're starving, yes. So, but how many of us are starving, really, right?
Well, not that many, but it is still a question of your perspective. And, although it's true that not many of us are starving, there is a large proportion of people in the world who are starving, who do go to bed hungry. And, so, if we're taking a really global perspective on the human species, it is worth thinking about the fact that we don't want to indict processed food in general, because for people in countries where food is really a security problem, processed food is important. And getting the highest quality of processing is really important for them.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I like that perspective.
Yeah. I must share this perspective on hedgehogs. You know what a hedgehog is?
They're adorable.
Yes, exactly. So they roll up and present spines in case a fox or something is coming along to try and eat them. Well, in Britain a few years ago, it was discovered that hedgehogs were being eaten by foxes much more than had earlier happened. And what was happening was that people were putting out bread to feed the hedgehogs because everyone was worried about the hedgehogs. And so then the hedgehogs got fat. And because they were so fat, they couldn't roll up enough to protect themselves from the foxes. And so the foxes were eating them. And so that meant that people were taking hedgehogs that they'd fed and then putting them into a bathtub with a bit of water and getting them to swim to take exercise to lose weight.
That is actually hilarious. I did not know that. One of the things you said in the book is that meat became more valuable and desirable with fire. Before fire, were people eating raw meat?
Oh, I'm sure they were. And the reason I say that is because chimpanzees do it, and so do every other primate that can find it. Chimps are pretty good at getting it because they're smart, fast, and strong, and they're able to hunt and kill monkeys. Um, but they show what is typical of many plant-eating animals, which is that if they get the opportunity to eat meat, then they will do so. But there's a limit to its value. And the limit is this: it's very tough to eat. Tough in both senses. It's literally physically tough, and therefore it makes it difficult for them to get enough value out of it. So if you give chimps raw meat, then they may spend an hour or two chewing on the muscle, which is the toughest part to eat. But then eventually they may just give up and leave it in order to go out and eat something that provides more calories, namely their basic food, raw fruit. Whereas once you can cook it, then that makes the meat tender, provided you cook it reasonably well, and easy to chew. And then that way you can pack in pounds of meat relatively quickly. So cooking did to meat what cooking did to plant foods. It with all these things, it made them easier to uh, get large numbers of calories into your stomach.
Right. Thanks. And thank you, Sherry, for the super chat donation. One of the things you said in the book was that the guts, the liver, and the brains are eaten first by primates, but humans rarely eat these parts, preferring the muscle. The muscle, isn't that the hardest part to eat, though?
Yeah, but I mean, I think isn't it because of cooking? Um, and mind you, I'm not sure really how culturally sensitive that comment was because I am not confident about the order of eating if you are a hunter-gatherer or others. Um, I know that there are circumstances in which livers are greatly preferred. I've read that about Inuit, where they may take out the liver and quickly eat it. Um, but at any rate, I would imagine that the reason that the preferences change with cooked food is because muscle, the meat, becomes so much more easy to eat once it is cooked. And another possibility is that what we're really talking about most often is eating the meat of agricultural animals, and very often it's marbled with fat in a way that is not true for wild animals. And the thing about brains and the liver and gut is that they have quite a lot of fat in them. But once you have domesticated animals, then there's much more fat in the meat, so that makes it more attractive too.
Well, that's the thing that the animal products that are eaten today are nothing like the animal products that were eaten by our ancestors.
Yeah, that's very true. Um, and
They're not using hormones, antibiotics, all those kind of things.
well, yes, of course, that's right. That's right.
And they're probably, I mean, they weren't eating dairy products either. I mean, there was no cheese, yogurt, or ice cream.
That's all very recent. All the eating of dairy. That's right.
Yeah.
And of course,
And
it's a fascinating area
they weren't
because
eating
we
oil either. There was no oil. There was no flour. There was no sugar.
absolutely right. No, I mean, Michael Pollan asked us to eat real food, and but even he, I think, does not appreciate what real food really is, and real food is you take a root that you dig up from the ground, and you let that roll around in the ashes of a simple fire, and then you dust the ashes off and eat that. There's if we go back, I think not very long, 15,000 years maybe, you wouldn't find much of a recipe for anything. The very few foods would be really combined into any kind of single dish.
Yeah. Well, how did our ancestors eat things like tubers without fire? I mean, I've tried raw potato and sweet potato, and I don't care for it. And you certainly can't eat grains and beans raw unless you maybe sprout them.
Yeah, no, I mean there were quite a few things that we would not eat at all because cooking destroys the toxins in them, such as a lot of beans. As far as the roots go, it just takes a lot more chewing. And one of the things that happens when you go from before 2 million years ago to after 2 million years ago is that the teeth become smaller. But prior to that, the bigger teeth were, excuse me, used to mash these foods. Now, one of the ways in which our um, our eating habits have changed enormously, and this answers your question about how would we eat something like a raw potato, is we would eat them much more slowly. Uh, the estimates, the best estimates that we have are that if we were nowadays reduced to a raw diet of the type that our great apes eat, so that's the type that our ancestors would have eaten, then we would spend more than 6 hours a day chewing our food. How much time do we spend nowadays chewing our food? It's less than 1 hour. So there's been a huge reduction in just the amount of time spent chewing the food. And that has, of course, changed our lives utterly. It's had enormous consequences because it has freed our time to do all sorts of things other than just simply sit there eating. Um, but in addition, it's a worthwhile point to focus on because it reminds us of just how hard work it is to eat a raw food diet of a type that is really natural as opposed to the urban raw food diets that come from the supermarkets.
Right, where you're having a lot of smoothies and juices and using machines and technology and
Yes,
dehydrating.
and carrots that have got incredibly little fiber in them compared to the carrots that you would find in a wild carrot.
Right. I'm guessing that our ancestors didn't use salt either. I mean, there was none.
That's right. No, the salt just had to come from the diet. Now, we know something about the sources of salt for chimpanzees. And partly, I think the reason that they really like chewing meat is because they get salt out of meat. But if they don't catch much meat, then they have another way to get salt. And in the area where I'm studying in Uganda, what it is the wood of a dead tree when that dead tree has grown up in a swamp and died in the swamp. And as the tree trunk rots, then what happens is that water from the swamp comes up into the tree trunk and then evaporates by capillary action. It gets sucked up. And the slow result over the years is that the wood of that rotten tree trunk becomes a little bit richer in salt than anywhere else because the salt has come into the swamp and accumulated there from the surrounding slopes. Well, that is enough for the chimps to make deliberate efforts every now and again, maybe twice a week, to go off to the swamp and find one of those trees and eat some of that rotten wood. And they chew it and they swallow it. And we now know that that has a concentration of salt that is some 5 to 10 times higher than in any of the other of their foods. And so it's worth it for them. But it still means they're getting incredibly little salt compared to what we get. And it's a reminder that we eat far too much salt, including me, I may say.
Absolutely. So, how did our ancestors eat things like nuts and seeds? I mean, and coconuts. How could they even? Because people now are so worried about their omega-3 fatty acids, saying you got to eat nuts and seeds every day. Our ancestors couldn't have eaten that many of them.
No, I mean, depending on where they were, obviously, if they're relying on the seaside, then they get more, or some of the fishy products in rivers. But I, a lot of them would not have had very ready access to omega 3s. Um, People sometimes exaggerate the need for it and on the idea that we really can't synthesize them at all. But there are synthetic pathways that enable us to pay a little extra to get omega 3s. Um, but if you can get them in your diet, then that's nice too. So it may not have been a sort of critical shortage for our ancestors so much as an extra caloric cost that they've got to pay to synthesize it, or they can get it themselves. And obviously, if they can get it themselves, then that's much better.
Right. Thank you. That's so interesting. And I thought one of the most interesting parts in the book, actually fascinating, was when you talked about the surgeon. I believe his name was William Beaumont, that studied the stomach that never healed. It was, I guess, a gunshot wound, and then they could actually watch everything.
Yes, this was an early study of exactly what is going on in our guts. And this unfortunate man, who, as a result of a gunshot wound, was left with a hole in the side of his stomach, and that hole came all the way out to the open air. So what Dr. Beaumont was able to do was to take a lump of meat and literally put it into the stomach of this man, and then leave it there for an hour, 5 hours, whatever, and then pull it out again. So the way he did this was just put it on a cotton thread and take it out again. And this is one of the first indications about how cooked food was so much more easily digested than raw food, because he would take a piece of cooked meat or a piece of raw meat about the same size and put them in the stomach of this guy, and then pull them out after an hour and see which one had been more digested. And obviously, it was the cooked. The poor subject, he had this happen to him in his 20s, and you might think that he would have died shortly afterwards. In fact, he lived. I think it was over 80 when he died, and he was active, canoeing up and down rivers in the United States. So he didn't like being experimented on, and he eventually broke his relationship with Dr. Beaumont completely. But nevertheless, he lived a long time and contributed a lot to science.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting. So there is a very prominent doctor in the whole food, plant-based raw food movement named Dr. Doug Graham. He actually lives in England now, and he would like me to ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
Let's go.
Thank you. So I'm going to put my glasses on for this to see them. So one question is, I'm curious why Dr. Richard Leakey, the famed anthropologist, says in his book, The Origins of Humankind, that the general consensus among anthropologists is that the human brain development occurred when humans switched from food with a very low calorie yield to foods with a higher caloric density. That's the question.
Okay, well, so that I think follows what is generally appreciated now by anthropologists, which is that the brain consumes so many calories that the critical question, or a critical question, about how it evolved and enlarged in the human ancestry was how humans afforded giving it sufficient calories. So let's just look at the numbers here. The brain weighs, I think, 2.5% of an average person's body weight, but it consumes about 10 times that, about 25% of humans' calories. And of course, the point about a brain is you can't turn it off. It's not like a computer. Even at night, it's consuming its calories. And basically, you die when the brain runs so short of calories that it can't function anymore. So what Richard Leakey was doing was responding to this idea that there was a way in which humans were able to get more calories that was responsible for the enlargement of the brain. And I've argued that cooking was a very big part of that equation. And indeed, around 1.9 million years ago, you see the size of the human brain beginning to really take off, and it was steadily increasing pretty much ever since then. Some people have argued that it was increased meat eating that was important around that time. And of course, I think that as people were able to cook more, then they were able to eat more meat, and that may have contributed as well. So, it's still a little bit debated as to exactly what the source of the calories was, but the principle is that humans have been able to afford this huge brain because, more than our cousin apes, we've been able to find a way to provide fuel for that brain. And by the way, one of the connections to cooking in this respect is that once you cook, then you don't need to have such a big gut. And the gut is a very expensive organ, and the calculations actually show that the reduction in the size of the human gut compared to the great apes is pretty nicely balanced by the increase in the number of calories you need to fuel the brain. In other words, small gut allows a big brain.
Yep, I remember reading that in your book. Okay, we have two more questions from Dr. Graham. And if Dr. Graham can take the time to write in your questions, you guys can do the same. He says, I'm curious. My understanding is that Homo sapiens and at least 8 other Homo species before them have been around for perhaps 2 to 3 million years or longer. I'm having difficulty understanding how, if for a couple of million years, humans weren't smart enough to control fire in order to cook our food, how cooked food made us smarter enough to even start cooking our food.
Well, I'm not quite sure I get the question, but so here's the picture. Around 2 million years ago, Homo erectus starts to cook food, and gets the adaptations associated with needing to cook food. And then all of those other species of humans that you talk about, subsequently to that, have been obligate cooks. They have required to be able to cook. So there's a lineage from Homo erectus to Homo heidelbergensis to Homo sapiens. And then there are also all sorts of divergent species like Neanderthals and Denisovans. And now in some of those, we have excellent evidence that they cooked. There are more recent ones like Neanderthals. In others, we have to reconstruct it. And we're not absolutely sure. But I've made my arguments about why I think that we should expect that all of them cooked. There was one prior to Homo erectus, which people have sometimes called Homo habilis. But this one does not show any evidence of having been a cook. I prefer to call it Australopithecus habilis. It has kind of intermediate adaptations between Homo and the earlier ancestor, the ape-like ancestor, Australopithecus. And I don't think that was an obligate cook, but it may well have been a species that was experimenting with cooking. So the story is that you've got an experimental cook, which is the Australopithecus or Homo habilis, and then an obligate cook, Homo erectus, and all of the subsequent species became increasingly big-brained, and they were a species that cooked.
Right. So you were saying in the book that it was the cooking of food that allowed our brains to become bigger.
Yes, thank you. Exactly.
Okay, great. Well, I'm just good. I want to make sure I understood it correctly. And the last question from Dr. Graham, and thank you, Dr. Graham, for submitting the questions. Finally, I'm curious, as we know for fact that a wide variety of negative and mind-numbing factors are cooked into foods, especially foods cooked over an open fire, carcinogens, mutagens, tumorigens, tremorigens, tetragens, and a large number of anti-nutrients. How could the dumbing effect associated with eating cooked foods have resulted in improved intelligence?
Well, thank you for all these questions, and it's just great. And I'm sorry we can't talk directly, but I think the very important negative effects you're drawing attention to, many of them coming from the production of Maillard compounds in cooking, just point up to the fact that in the wild, even though you do get these small amounts of these toxins and other negative factors, calories are what is really important. Simply getting enough calories to be able to maintain and increase your body weight, and in the case of females, being able to nurture your babies and return quickly to a state of fecundability where you can have your next baby. Calorie shortage is the big story for the wild. And of course, in our case, once we are thinking about contemporary humans, that's not true. The big story for contemporary humans is calorie excess and reducing the exposure to the kinds of negative factors that you're talking about. So I think what it shows is the way we have changed.
Just to be fair, like when we talked about why for many people a raw food diet may not be favorable, what about these diets today, like the carnivore diet, which is just meat? That can't be consistent with our species' natural history either.
I would say the carnivore diet is definitely at variance with our natural history. That's right. The difficult thing about all these diets is that different individuals have got different bodies. And it may turn out that there are some individuals for whom, for one reason or another, one of these specialist diets really works. So it's not as if anybody can um, say in advance, as it were, what is going to be good for a particular other individual. And by the way, I just want to emphasize that with raw diets, I'm a big supporter of raw diets if you are the kind of person for whom they work. I've got nothing negative to say about them from the point of view of someone, particularly if they're trying to lose weight. It's a great way to do it. What I don't approve of is raw diets that are imposed on people who don't want them. And so let me just, emphasize that is what has occasionally happened with children. Children are brought up, have occasionally been brought up on a raw diet. That is really dangerous. It's fine to do it as an adult when you know what you're doing and you've got good reasons for it and you've thought it out and so on. But it is actually, I think, real cruelty and should be legally banned to bring a child up on a raw diet, because the danger of starvation is really severe and the danger of long-term negative consequences is very severe.
But you wouldn't say that about a well-balanced plant-based diet, though, right? I mean,
Oh, no. I mean, once you're cooking, I think vegan diets. There's all sorts of evidence that they're really good. I mean, obviously, you do have to make sure you have a supply of vitamin B12, but that is the main thing. And other than that, I think that people, if I had the strength of mind, I would be a vegan. I am tempted by a little bit of fish, and even occasionally, if someone gives me chicken, I'll eat it. But I think that it's really admirable to do what you do, to go full vegan. It's hard for me to imagine that the world is not going to end up in that state. I mean, I think it's great that we're reducing the amount of we're eating, and I just hope that carries on.
but how do you think the world is going to end up? Because now with global warming, I mean, a lot of these experts that I've interviewed are saying if the world doesn't go vegan, we're not going to have a planet.
I can well imagine that it's going to be very difficult to keep going without going vegan, and there are hints of the kind of the moral issues now, but I would imagine that our social norms will really change so that the notion of eating meat will become much more distasteful at a societal level. But of course, it's complicated by the fact that there are lands where it's very difficult to grow plants, and it's far more efficient to grow animals. I personally don't like the idea of eating mammals, um, but I'm sure it'll take time for it to be sort of totally eradicated.
How the heck did we stay warm before fire? As a person who is always cold, which is why I live in the desert. I just can't imagine, living in the Stone Age or any other time without warmth.
Well, the thing is that, but before fire, we'd have had hair. I feel sure that the reason that we lost so much of our good insulation is because we had fire. Because the time when you need your insulation is when you're doing nothing. You don't need it when you're walking about during the day, because you can just move and be active, and that generates enough heat to keep you warm. The problem is at night. But once you have fire to keep you warm at night, then you don't need the hair. And then it's a great advantage to get rid of the hair, because that means that instead of having to sweat and lose heat by other means, then you don't have to pay all those costs. You can keep cool enough without as a result of not having the hair. So take us back 2 million years, and I bet we had hairy ancestors. But after that, we became like us now.
You just explained why sometimes people that have anorexia get what's called lanugo, where they actually grow hair over their body. And
I didn't know that. Is that right?
It's absolutely true. Lanugo. Some people with anorexia get it's lanugo, where they grow soft blonde hair all over their face and body in an attempt to keep warm.
Well, that's so fascinating. Thank you.
Oh
Okay.
my God. Well, thank you. I mean, I'm just having the best time talking to you. I got to tell you, I don't usually get this excited, but one of my favorite parts of your book is when you talk about the modern form of the sexual division of labor and how many calories each sex provided. And it's a little bit different today than it was back then, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, our hunter-gatherer ancestors, yeah, I mean, in some ways, actually, I find it kind of, hilarious that we have a system which is somewhat similar to our hunter-gatherer ancestry, because, to some extent, the stereotypes persist of the men go out to work and the women stay home with the babies, and they're the ones who you find in the supermarkets who are foraging for the food and bring it home and cook it. And that's basically what we had in our ancestry. Um, Now, a sort of classic view is that let's say one kind of trope is the notion that men brought home the meat, women brought home the plant food, and it's about 50-50. Turns out there's lots of variation in that, of course. So the variants go from men producing less than half the meat, women producing or less than half the calories, women producing more than half the calories, say 70% in some desert peoples in Africa. And so men's contribution is not that important. On the other hand, you have people living in the really high latitudes where more of the food is animal food, all the way to the Inuit, where it's close to 100% being animal food. And there, almost all of the food is produced by the men. And here's what's so striking: it doesn't matter whether the woman is producing more food or the man is producing more food. Either way, the woman gets to do the cooking, and she is, it's a very striking and I suppose somewhat disturbing perspective to realize that this stereotype of the men going out to do things and the women staying home and cooking is certainly true of the hunter-gatherer ancestry that we know about.
Well, and it's interesting because, like, I'm a chef, and the world's greatest chefs are always the men, supposedly. I don't necessarily agree, but I like to do the cooking because I like food to taste good. I don't want to leave it to my husband.
Yes, right, and you might think that men would feel the same about it, but of course, nowadays we think of cuisine, but in the hunter-gatherer groups that I have been with, I think are representative of all those of the past. There really wasn't a cuisine. During the I don't know, during the carrot season, it's carrots every night, and by the way, an occasional pig or whatever it is. And during the potato season, it's potatoes every night, and they're all always cooked in exactly the same way. If it's carrots, then they're rolled around in the ashes and just warmed up a little bit, and so on. So the actual quality of the cooking had to be good enough to reach that sort of standard degree of deliciousness, but it was not as if there was competition among people to produce something really delicious.
Right. They were
So,
eating to live rather than living to eat. And they weren't throwing
well,
sugar. They weren't showing putting oil, sugar, and salt on everything like what most people do.
yeah, and then very limited use of herbs. Um, a little bit of mixing of foods, mostly for food storage, but very little in terms of the daily construction of foods.
And they weren't even using recipes. They didn't need the Food Network or cookbooks.
That's true. That's right. No, I mean it's really dauntingly simple.
It's just what the work you do, and Dr. Ponsner too. It's so fascinating. And I know you guys are friends and colleagues. Were there any parallels between him studying the Hadza and you studying the primates that you guys came up with?
Um, well, I don't know. I, I mean, I think the basic story about comparing chimpanzees and humans is the striking difference. So for me, As I say, I studied feeding behavior of chimpanzees in the 1970s. And it was not until halfway through the 1990s that I suddenly said to myself, you know, there's something different about humans from chimpanzees. And that is that, we cook our food. And since then, I've really emphasized this point and really explored it in some detail. The astonishing thing to me was that when I first produced the idea to my colleagues that cooking could have been hugely important in human evolution, I, first of all, there's very little discussion of this point at all to be found in the anthropological literature. And secondly, to the extent that there was considerable resistance to it. So when I produced a paper saying that to be able to cook your potatoes would really make a difference to the number of calories you could get out of them, the paper was published in a journal called Current Anthropology, which had allowed for commentary. And the comments in response to that paper were deeply skeptical. And they included one from maybe the senior nutritional analyst of primate diets, who flatly denied that that there would be any caloric advantages to cooking. I'm reminded of what happened when the great French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss produced his book called The Raw and the Cooked. And when he produced it, he said, all humans cook their food and no animals do. And this is very, very important, he said, but it's only important from the point of view of cognition, of the way that we think about the world. We think about the world as humans being different from nature. Humans have culture and cooking, animals have nature and raw food. And what was so striking is that no biologists said to him, well, why do you think it's only important from a cognitive point of view? Shouldn't it be important from a biological point of view as well? Everyone seemed to accept the notion that cooking had nothing to do with biology. And you can sort of see why, because almost every food that we do eat cooked, we can eat raw. And we are an animal. Animals eat their food raw. It would seem to make sense that we can eat our food raw and could have done in the past. And it's not until you actually compare what hunters and gatherers really do with what chimpanzees really do that you see there is this huge difference.
Well, primates are so smart. I mean, they can learn sign language. Has anybody thought to teach them to cook? And I'm not being facetious. I mean, seriously.
Well, a few people have played with it, and you're right. It's an ape that was taught sign language, Kanzi. The person who worked with him, Sue Savage Rumbaugh, she's got a movie in which she takes Kanzi out into the woods in Georgia where she and Kanzi lived, and in the movie you see Kanzi collecting wood, using a lighter to light a fire, taking a frying pan and putting sausages on the frying pan and eating the sausages. He liked to eat them cooked. And people have gone further than that and tried to figure out what are the kind of mental abilities that enable you to cook without really being taught that much. And they include the fact, shown in chimpanzees by Alex Rosati and Felix Warneken, that chimpanzees are perfectly willing to forego eating a piece of raw food, in this case it was sweet potato, in order to be able to cook it. And they would carry food to be able to cook it. They would sit there and wait for it to be cooked. So they're very, very close to being able to cook. The problem, of course, I think, is that they have no indication that they are able to maintain a fire, keep a fire going, that sort of thing.
That is just so interesting. And what you mentioned in your book that on the USDA website, they show cooked carrots and raw carrots having the same calories. That's not possible, is it?
Well, you see, this is part of the problem that that people were so surprised at the notion that cooked food provides more calories than raw food. And part of the reason is um, the way in which we calculate the number of calories available from a food. And the way we do it is using the Atwater system. This is the standard practice pretty much all over the world. And the Atwater system, what it comes down to is you blow the food up. You provide a spark to a dried bit of food, and then you burn it, and you see how many calories are released. And they do this with a chunk of raw carrot or a chunk of cooked carrot. And the answer is that more calories are released with the raw carrot than the cooked carrot. And then they imply that you eating a raw carrot get more calories than you eating a cooked carrot. Well, the problem with that is that we do not blow up the food in our stomachs. You do not take a dried bit of food and provide a spark and let it burn inside your stomach. Instead, you take the food and then you add acid to it and you churn it with your muscles and you use about 25 different physiological processes to slowly digest the food and eventually absorb it across the gut wall and into your blood. And all of those processes cost metabolic energy, and the amount of energy that they take is greater for raw food than cooked food. So the system that the government uses, and is used all over the world, to assess the number of calories in a food is unrealistic from the point of view of our biology. And we need to use a different system, but it's been in place for 120 years or something, and it's going to take a lot to shift it, because in some ways it's kind of simple and provides a nice simple answer. It's just that the answer is inaccurate when we compare raw food and cooked food.
Yeah. So we have a live viewer asking a question. Do you think the body burns more calories digesting cooked food or raw food?
It definitely burns more calories digesting cooked raw food. Raw food, it just those 20 or more physiological processes that I mentioned that are used in the digestion of food are going to be much more costly for your raw food, starting with the fact that your raw food is going to spend more time in the stomach, where one of the costliest processes of digestion is involved, which is namely the production of acid in the parietal cells lining the stomach. And at every level, it's more costly with the foods that are harder to digest, like the raw food. So it's a great way to get your body to spend work, if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. We mentioned at the beginning that all species, when offered cooked food, prefer, at least the ones that you've tested, it seems to be most of it. But with the primates that you studied, did they seem to prefer animal food over plant food, or was it again just a function of whatever's going to give them the most calories?
Well, I mean, chimps, absolutely, they get really, really excited by eating animal food. So their basic diet, which can be 80% of their total time spent eating, 60% in places, but anyway, always more than half is fruit. And the fruits that they're eating tend to be rather dry and full of fiber, so they take quite a lot of chewing. And if they see an opportunity to eat an animal, they get incredibly excited and they absolutely love it. And they will fight with each other for the animal. They will, once they got a piece of food, of animal matter, then they will run away so that no one else can take it away from them. Very often what happens with the chimps is that the males will take some prey and try and hide from each other at the top of a tree. You'll get a little meat-eating cluster at the top of a tree, and then bits of food will fall down to the ground. And down on the ground, you have some maybe subordinate males or females or juveniles trying to pick up even little scraps of food. You even see a drop of blood landing on a leaf and 2 or 3 chimps racing forward to lick the blood off a leaf. So there's no question about just how excited they get about the opportunity to eat animal food. But as I said earlier, after they've eaten it for an hour or two, they might give up and go back to eating fruit because they know where the source of calories, the steady source of calories, is, and it's as if they have a sort of special fruit hunger.
So I think you said in the book that hunter and gatherers got about 50% of their calories from meat. Is it the same thing that they prefer it when they can get it, but they'll make do with vegetation when that's all there is?
Yeah, basically, what you said is just right. Of course, hunters and gatherers they do vary wherever they are. I mean, according to where they are in the world, in how much proportion of meat and plants they get, because in the Arctic there are no plants to eat.
Wow.
But where you have a much more balanced diet between meat and plants, then the plants provide the daily staple. And if it's on one particular day of the week and they can't find any meat at all, then everyone's happy eating, or they're tolerant, let's put it that way, eating just the plants.
Okay.
Maybe there'll be a series of boiled seeds or roasted roots, or something like that. But they get really thrilled when the meat comes in. When the meat comes in, that's the evenings when people dance, maybe all night, when the singing starts and the stories start, and they eat as much meat as they can until they get roaring diarrhea, as they say. That's how much they they like it.
It's just so interesting to me because I'm somebody that I became vegan for ethical reasons 45 years ago, but I actually never liked meat. And I'm wondering what is wrong with me that it wasn't hard for me because I never cared for dairy or fish, or I never liked it. I didn't want to eat it growing up. And so I guess maybe I'm just an anomaly because I just think plants are more delicious than meat. And also when you think about not the hunter and gatherers, because you mentioned they're not using a lot of spices, but when you think of the typical American that's eating meat, they're eating it with plants. They're not eating raw meat. They're eating it cooked, and then they're eating it with ketchup that comes from plants or barbecues. They're eating it. The condiments are always what makes food delicious, and that's from plants.
Well, it's true. So what's wrong with you? I think probably you haven't been hungry enough.
I used to be fat, so I mean I don't know,
Well,
but
somehow yes, you lost weight, but the people for whom meat is this tremendous thrill are people who are living in a pretty difficult circumstance from the point of view of getting enough food and enough variety. And the particular kind of food that they are not really getting much of at all is fat very often. And I think people often talk about meat as a source of protein, and I think that's much less important than meat as a source of fat. I remember in my first month or two of living with FA pygmies in the Congo, an elephant was killed by an outsider. And the people in the agriculture, the farmer camps and the pygmy camps all went out to go and eat some of this elephant. Well, it was a 4 or 5 hour walk to get to the elephant deep in the forest. And so the first thing that everybody did was to cut up the meat, boil it, and then there'd be like an inch or two of fat at the top of the pan. And they just took some kind of ladle and spooned that fat straight into their mouths. They were just thrilled at being able to eat that. And by the way, that elephant was still being eaten 9 months later when I left the study site.
it didn't spoil.
No, because what happened was that people would cut up strips of it and then put it on the rafters of the huts, and there'd be a fire constantly burning in the bottom of the hut, and enough smoke would come up that it just gave a little bit of smoking to that meat, and so they were able to keep eating it all those months later.
Yeah, that's so interesting when you talk about the fat, because I was raised Jewish, and my grandmother, the schmaltz, she used to, and then other people would take that bacon fat, and you know what I'm talking about, back in the day, and then they'd scoop it to cook again. They
Okay.
pour it in a jar or a can.
Yes, but did you ever just take the fat from there and just
Yeah, then they would cook with it. But maybe you're right. Maybe I haven't really been hungry because when you think about it, in extreme cases, people have eaten other people because they were hungry, like in the Andes plane crash.
That's true. That's right. I mean, you've got to be very, very hungry for that. But yeah, I've always said that I don't want to eat mammals until I'm hungry enough to eat them. And if I'm hungry enough to eat them, I could easily be hungry enough to eat a human.
Oh my God, that's
I
just
mean,
so
everybody is,
interesting.
you know, we're all the same.
One of the things that I thought was so interesting in your book, because we had talked earlier in the show about how a raw food really can only thrive in a modern urban environment, not in nature anymore, is that experiment they did. Did they do it in a zoo? That is really interesting. The BBC.
Oh, the BBC, yes, where they had people eating raw food and just seeing how much weight they lost, and it was very striking. And, you know, in all these experiments, you get the same sort of thing happening, which is that people lose weight, they cheat, you know, they smuggle in candy bars or whatever it is, if they possibly can, and they appreciate cooked food all the more. You know, there was a former student of mine who was teaching about cooked and raw food, and he had students write diaries about their feeling about food. So, at the beginning of he was called Kevin Hunt. He teaches in Indiana, and he gave the students the opportunity to eat some boiled rice, and he had them write down what it was like, just ordinary straight boiled rice, and they said it was plain and tasteless and boring and basically not very nice. And then he had them eat raw food for a week. And then he said, okay, now we're going to give you boiled rice again. And then they described it again. And now they said it was rich and meaty and delicious. It was just the best thing they'd ever had. So much depends on on the context in which you come. If you've been eating raw food, then meat and rice and you know, anything cooked is just suddenly absolutely delicious.
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that we as humans now have pretty much small jaws, small teeth, does that make us adapted to a different diet than the primates that you studied?
Well, yes, I mean, you know, our small teeth are like our small mouths and our small guts. They're all part of the system that have led us to become adapted to eating cooked food, or literally to lose our adaptations to eating raw food. If you don't need big teeth, then it's better not to have them because they're more likely to crack and get in the way and take up energy and so on. So I think that somebody coming from outer space would fairly rapidly come to the conclusion that we have now, which is that we are a species that is specially adapted to eating our food cooked, and that's happened ever since our teeth got smaller, which was 2 million years ago.
Right. And we see in whether we're raw or vegan or what, we see most people do seem to prefer it cooked, whatever they're eating.
Yes. So you know, if you want to eat food raw, you have to fight against your ancestry. You have to fight against the way that evolution has made us into a species that not only benefits from eating our food cooked, but enormously prefers it.
Wow. Dr. Wrangham, I know I went over, but really, this was such an honor and such a pleasure and privilege to talk to you. And I know you have another book, which I haven't read, but after I do, maybe you can come back and talk about that one.
Well, it would be wonderful. It's my honor to be here with you today. And thank you so much for great questions from yourself and from one or two other people.
Absolutely. You're just such a remarkable person. Thank you so much for your contribution and for your work. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow at 11 a.m. when my guest is GI Dr. Vanessa Mendez and registered dietitian Amanda Sevilla. Thank you so much, Dr. Wrangham. This has been such a delight.
Thanks a lot, AJ.